In the hallowed halls of the United States Senate, where history hangs heavy in the air like the scent of old oak and ambition, a moment of high drama unfolded. Senator John Kennedy, the sharp-witted, silver-tongued son of Louisiana, stepped up to the podium with a fire in his eyes and a mission in his heart. The chamber, usually a place of measured debates and diplomatic pleasantries, was about to witness a verbal reckoning. Kennedy wasn't there to exchange niceties or play the Washington game of calculated compromise. No, he was there to confront Representative Jasmine Crockett, a rising star from Texas known for her fiery rhetoric and media-savvy attacks on President Donald Trump. The topic? Wasteful government spending, a subject Kennedy wielded like a bayou alligator, snapping its jaws at inefficiency. Before we dive into this tale of political theater, let me ask, where are you reading from? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest stories exposing the truth in Washington. Now let's set the stage for what happened in that solemn Senate chamber. The atmosphere in the Senate was heavy, almost electric, as Kennedy approached the podium. His presence commanded attention, not through bluster or theatrics, but through the quiet intensity of a man who knew he was about to drop a bombshell. His gaze, sharp as a blade and cold as a Louisiana swamp at dawn, swept across the room. Senators shifted in their seats, sensing that something big was coming. Kennedy, with his thick Southern drawl and penchant for folksy metaphors, was no stranger to making waves, but this time, he had a specific target: Representative Jasmine Crockett. Crockett, a civil rights lawyer turned congresswoman from Texas's 30th district, had made a name for herself with her bold, unapologetic style. She was a frequent guest on television, from the serious stages of CNN with Jim Acosta to the glitzy sets of late-night shows like The Late Show with Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel Live. On these platforms, she didn't hold back, branding President Trump a billionaire con man and mocking efforts to streamline federal spending as political stunts designed to distract from real issues. She had called for Trump's impeachment over everything from a mysterious $400 million airplane to murky cryptocurrency transactions, positioning herself as a fierce critic of the former president and his allies. But Kennedy wasn't buying the act. To him, Crockett's performances were just that, performances. He saw her as a defender of a bloated, convoluted federal spending system that was bleeding the American people dry. And he was ready to call her out, not just for her rhetoric, but for what he saw as a betrayal of the hardworking taxpayers she claimed to represent. Kennedy's voice, warm yet steely, cut through the silence of the Senate chamber like a knife through butter. Representative Crockett, he began, his Louisiana drawl wrapping each word in a layer of Southern charm, laced with biting sarcasm. You can go on TV as much as you like, calling out President Trump and throwing stones like you're pitching in the World Series. But the American people aren't watching for a performance. They're watching their wallets, and they're fed up with the wasteful spending you're defending. The room fell deathly silent. Senators, aides, and onlookers held their breath, knowing Kennedy was just getting started. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the rows of seats as if searching for Crockett herself, though she wasn't present in the Senate chamber. The woman from Texas, he continued, loves to talk about justice, But what kind of justice is it when folks in Shreveport or Dallas are taxed to fund programs they don't even know about? Programs like $20 million for Sesame Street in Iraq. Big Bird in Baghdad, folks. Can you believe it? A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Kennedy's face remained serious, his half-smile betraying a mix of amusement and outrage. He wasn't there to entertain, though his wit made it hard not to listen. He was there to expose what he saw as a fundamental betrayal of the American people, a government that spent their hard-earned money on frivolous, far-flung projects while ignoring their real needs at home. Kennedy flipped open a binder, its pages filled with the government's spending ledger, and began reading like a detective uncovering a trail of dark secrets. "Let me tell you what the American people's tax dollars are being thrown at," he said, his voice rising with each example. "Things Representative Crockett seems to think are justice." He started with a figure that made the room shudder. $164 million from the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, funneled into Gaza, landing in the hands of organizations reported to have ties to Hamas, a group designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. Government. Kennedy paused, letting the number hang in the air like a storm cloud. "Imagine," he said, "a family in Texas, working hard, paying taxes, only to see their money fund groups calling to wipe out the Jewish scourge. Does Representative Crockett call that justice? I call it an insult to every American." The Senate chamber remained hushed, the weight of his words sinking in. But Kennedy wasn't done. He moved to another expenditure, his voice slow but sharp as a blade. $2 million, he said, raising his hand as if trying to grasp the logic, "to support gender reassignment surgeries in Guatemala." Now, Guatemala's a beautiful country, but why are folks in Baton Rouge or Houston paying for someone there to change their gender? Representative Crockett got an answer for that? Or are you too busy bashing President Trump on TV? He flipped to another page, revealing $20 million spent to produce a new version of Sesame Street in Iraq. Kennedy chuckled, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. "Do you know what Big Bird's doing in Baghdad? Me neither. But I know that $20 million could fix dozens of schools in Louisiana or build homes for the homeless in Dallas." "Miss Crockett, do you really think Texans want their money-making TV shows in Iraq?" The examples kept coming, each one more astonishing than the last. Kennedy highlighted $1.5 million spent to teach journalists in Sri Lanka to avoid using binary gender language. He raised an eyebrow, his tone dripping with skepticism. "I'm not sure what binary gender language is, but I bet if you asked any worker in Shreveport, they'd say, use that $1.5 million to fix roads or cut taxes. Representative Crockett, do you agree, or do you think this is smart spending?" Then came the bombshell. $10 million for a group in Yemen linked to Al-Qaeda, another U.S.-designated terrorist organization. "You heard that right," Kennedy said, his voice resonating with disbelief. "We're sending money to the same people our military is fighting against." "Representative Crockett, is this the justice you're defending?" He pointed out that these expenditures weren't just wasteful, they betrayed the trust of the American people who expected their government to use their tax dollars responsibly. Kennedy didn't stop there. He listed more. $1.5 million to promote LGBTQ advocacy in Jamaica, $3.9 million for diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI programs in Macedonia, $8.3 million for education on equity and inclusion in Thailand, and $8 million to rebuild the media ecosystem in Cuba. Each expenditure was presented like a stab at the public's trust. Ask a single mother in Dallas working 2 shifts to feed her kids, he said, if she wants her taxes funding these things. I bet she doesn't. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Kennedy paused, his voice lowering as if sharing a terrifying secret. Folks, 4.7 trillion, that's trillion with a T, is missing from federal accounts. Money no one can account for. That's not pocket change. That's bigger than the budgets of most countries. Representative Crockett, if you want to investigate someone, why not start with this money? He suggested that the disappearance of this massive sum wasn't accidental, but a sign of deep-seated corruption in the system Crockett was trying to protect. Kennedy's speech wasn't just about numbers, it was about people. He shifted gears, bringing the dry figures to life by telling the stories of ordinary Americans bearing the consequences of the waste he believed Crockett was shielding. Let's talk about the folks who pay for this nonsense, he said, raising his hands as if embracing the entire nation. First, he spoke of Maria, a single mother in Dallas, Texas, living in the heart of Crockett's district. Maria works 2 shifts a day, one at a restaurant, another at a supermarket, struggling to raise 3 children. Every month, she watches her paycheck shrink due to taxes, unaware that her money is being sent to Yemen to fund groups linked to terrorism or to Guatemala for gender reassignment surgeries. Kennedy looked directly at the Democratic senators' seats. Miss Crockett, have you ever met Maria? She doesn't want her money building transgender clinics in India. She wants a better school for her kids or a road without potholes. Next came James, a welder in Shreveport, Louisiana, who served in the military before returning to support his family. James, with calloused hands and a modest income, pays taxes only to learn that $20 million was spent to produce Sesame Street in Iraq. Kennedy shook his head, his voice filled with outrage. James fought for this country, and now he's paying for Big Bird to perform in Baghdad. Miss Crockett, you call that justice? I call it betrayal. Then there was Sarah, a retired teacher in Baton Rouge living on a modest pension. Inflation has forced her to cut back on essentials, yet she still pays taxes that fund $1.5 million for DEI lectures in Serbia. Kennedy raised a finger, drawing a question mark in the air. Sarah doesn't need DEI in Serbia. She needs a healthcare system that doesn't bankrupt her every time she sees a doctor. Miss Crockett, do you think Sarah agrees with spending $8.3 million on equity education in Thailand? Kennedy continued with Miguel, a small business owner in Houston struggling to keep his store afloat amid inflation and high taxes. Miguel, a legal immigrant who worked tirelessly to achieve the American dream, discovered that $4.7 trillion in tax dollars has vanished without a trace. Miguel doesn't want his money funding $10 million for a group tied to Al-Qaeda, Kennedy said, stepping forward from the podium. He wants a chance to grow his business, hire more people, build a future. Miss Crockett, do you ever think about people like Miguel when you defend these expenditures? Finally, he spoke of Emma, a veteran in New Orleans living in a neighborhood plagued by crime and crumbling infrastructure. Emma, bearing scars from her time in combat, feels betrayed knowing that $60 million was spent to supply condoms to Ghana while her neighborhood lacks streetlights and police. Emma sacrificed for this country, Kennedy said, his voice thick with emotion. But the country takes her money to buy condoms in Africa. Miss Crockett, would you dare look Emma in the eye and say that's the right thing to do? Kennedy's voice rose as he turned to the broader implications of the spending he was exposing. Folks, we're carrying a $36 trillion national debt, he said, raising his hand as if painting the number in the air. Picture a pile of money bigger than the economies of most countries. That's what we owe, and it's weighing down the shoulders of people like Maria in Dallas or James in Shreveport. He explained that this debt didn't just appear, it was the result of bad decisions from the Obama and Biden administrations, policies Crockett had enthusiastically supported. Representative Crockett, you praise bills like the American Rescue Plan, but do you know it added $1.9 trillion to that debt? He asked, his voice full of challenge. He called the Inflation Reduction Act a joke, pointing out that it added another $1 trillion to the national debt without reducing inflation as promised. Miss Crockett, you call that an investment? I call it throwing people's money into a bottomless pit. The $4.7 trillion missing from federal accounts was, to Kennedy, the greatest theft in history. Folks, $4.7 trillion doesn't just vanish like smoke, he said, stepping closer to the podium. It was stolen, hidden, or thrown into projects no one dares audit. Miss Crockett, you want to investigate President Trump over a plane? Why not investigate this money? Kennedy also raised questions about the unusual wealth of some politicians, mentioning Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Joe Biden, who amassed fortunes despite modest public servant salaries. How does someone making $400,000 a year end up with a $50 million fortune? He asked, his voice thick with skepticism. Miss Crockett, do you think the American people are too dumb to notice what's going on? He didn't directly accuse Crockett, but implied that her defense of big government spending was enabling a corrupt system. Kennedy's speech wasn't just a takedown, it was a call to action. He urged Congress, and Crockett in particular, to support a comprehensive audit of every federal agency. We can't let a $36 trillion debt keep crushing our children's future, he said, his voice ringing like a vow. We can't let corruption eat away at this country like a disease. Miss Crockett, if you truly care about the people of Texas, join us in cleaning up Washington. He praised President Trump and his team, including Elon Musk, for their efforts to hold the system accountable. Elon Musk is a torchbearer for truth, Kennedy said, suggesting Musk's audit team investigate agencies like the Department of Education and even Fort Knox, half joking that they should check if the gold's still there. He stressed that transparency wasn't just an option, it was a duty to the American people. Turning to Crockett's confrontational style, Kennedy couldn't resist a final jab. Miss Crockett loves throwing stones at President Trump like she's playing baseball, he said with a smirk. But if she's so good at throwing, why not aim at the messy spending she's defending? He referenced her TV appearances, including her challenge to Trump to take an IQ test on Jimmy Kimmel Live. "I suggest she try a federal budget test first," he quipped, drawing laughter from the room. "Let's see if she can explain why $1.5 million was spent teaching journalists in Sri Lanka about non-binary language." Kennedy also brought up the Atlanta airport incident, where Crockett was accused of cutting in front of disabled passengers to board a plane early. "I don't know if that story's true," he said, his voice soft but dripping with sarcasm. "But if Miss Crockett was in such a hurry, maybe she should spend that time checking where that $4.7 trillion went." The clash between Senator John Kennedy and Representative Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a personal showdown. It was a reflection of a deeper divide in American society. On one side, Kennedy represented those who believed in cutting government waste to ease the burden on taxpayers, prioritizing domestic needs like roads, schools, and healthcare. On the other, Crockett stood for a vision of government that invested in social justice and international aid, even if it meant higher spending and a growing national debt. Kennedy's examples: $164 million for groups tied to Hamas, $20 million for Sesame Street in Iraq, $4.7 trillion missing, painted a picture of a government out of touch with its people. Crockett, with her defensive programs like the American Rescue Plan and USAID's international initiatives, argued that these expenditures were investments in a better future. But to Kennedy, they were a betrayal of hardworking Americans like Maria, James, Sarah, Miguel, and Emma, who were struggling under the weight of inflation and taxes. The takeaway was clear: Americans must demand transparency from their government. As Kennedy urged, individuals can engage in community forums, use platforms like X to ask questions, or vote for leaders who prioritize domestic needs over lavish foreign projects. "Learn from Maria and Miguel," he said. "Your voice has power. Don't let expenditures like $1.5 million for non-binary language in Sri Lanka overshadow your community's needs." As Kennedy stepped away from the podium, the Senate chamber remained electric, like a hot wind sweeping through Louisiana's plains. His words had turned a confrontation into a rallying cry for change, a call for accountability that resonated beyond the marble walls of Washington. Senators clapped, some nodded in agreement, while others sat in stunned silence, grappling with the weight of his accusations. The story of Kennedy versus Crockett wasn't just about two politicians. It was about the American people and their right to know where their money was going. It was about the single mother in Dallas, the welder in Shreveport, the retired teacher in Baton Rouge, the small business owner in Houston, and the veteran in New Orleans. It was about a government that had lost its way and a call to bring it back to the people it served. So what can you do? Demand accountability. Ask your representatives tough questions. Use your voice on platforms like X to shine a light on waste. Subscribe to channels that expose the truth, and join the fight for a fairer, more prosperous America. As Senator John Kennedy said, "The American people aren't Washington's money printer. They're hard-working folks raising kids, building communities, and deserving of a government that respects their sweat and sacrifice." Thank you for reading, and stay tuned for the next chapter in the battle for transparency in Washington.